Well, good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a splendid show for you today. It is Tuesday morning, lots of news to get to, and I am joined by my friend Niall Stanage. Nice to see you, Niall.
A pleasure to see you, Robbie. The last time I saw you, you were wearing a bow tie, which I'm disappointed you haven't continued on to Tuesday morning.
But, and as I conceded, I did not tie it myself. It was a clip-on. I couldn't do it, man. It was too frickin' hard.
Take the convenient option, Robbie. It's always the best option. On a more serious note, what is in your radar today?
Well, actually a reaction to that dinner we attended over the weekend, Niall. Mainstream media figures so very proud of themselves for admitting their own errors with respect to the buried story of President Joe Biden's cognitive decline. But one person who isn't letting them off the hook so easily is White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, who tore into the White House Correspondents' Dinner guests on Monday. Now, as I discussed yesterday during my radar, one of the awardees at the Saturday Correspondents' Dinner, which, by the way, I attended, as did Niall, was Axios' Alex Thompson, who did important work exposing Biden's diminishing abilities and was one of the mainstream journalists who did eventually raise questions about whether Biden was up for the job, whether he should be running for another term, whether he would be actually able to serve for another 4 years. At the dinner, Thompson accepted his award and made brief remarks. He did inform the gathered journalists that their collective failure to report on Biden's decline and helped erode trust in media, and that it's important for them to admit their mistake. The room received these remarks with applause after he said it. Now, Leavitt was asked at Monday's press briefing about Thompson's speech. Here was her response.
I do agree with that assessment from Alex Thompson, who I understand won an award for writing a story months and perhaps years after the American people already knew that story to be true. Millions of Americans watched our mentally incompetent president struggle with his day-to-day duties of this office. We watched our country be ran into the ground as a result, and nobody in the media wanted to write about that, talk about it. There were many reporters, I will say, right-leaning reporters who did talk about that, who didn't get awards, didn't get coverage. In fact, they were lambasted for their coverage. And I remember being on President Trump's campaign, talking about Joe Biden's clear mental incompetence and being accused by people in this room of manufacturing deep fake videos, trying to persuade the public into not believing what they saw with their own eyes for many years. And I think it's about time the legacy media finally admits that was one of the greatest cover-ups and scandals that ever took place in American history, and certainly it did contribute to the decline in the trust that Americans have for the legacy media. Peter, which, by the way, is why we've made many changes to this briefing room in this White House. It's long overdue. Peter.
Leavitt has a point. Alternative, contrarian, and conservative media had been asking probing questions about Biden's fitness long before this became a topic of interest to the mainstream media. But conservatives just didn't have the same level of access to Biden that the MSM did, which was a huge problem. As Leavitt points out, the Trump administration has worked to correct this and now includes in press briefings tons of conservatives and alternative media figures and influencers, particularly those who work in new media. The mainstream media has certainly noticed the presence of these figures, whom they view essentially as interlopers. In reporting on Leavitt's inclusive policies, the New York Times made a handy chart of all the new faces in the new media seat, characteristically describing the new media ventures with mainstream sensibilities in neutral terms and characterizing the conservative ones as, well, conservative. Now, while I welcome Leavitt's changes to the press briefing room, I will say this. I've noticed these press briefings are increasingly becoming opportunities for pro-Trump influencers to, instead of asking questions, essentially grandstand and own the libs, which really isn't the point of all this, as much as I may find it amusing. Conservative journalists and independent content creators should use their increased access to ask the hard-hitting questions that the mainstream media won't ask, or else they'll just be replicating the very kinds of softball questions routinely they rightly deride the mainstream media for succumbing to. Remember, the problem is not the media being too mean or too unfair to poor old Donald Trump. The press is supposed to be adversarial to the president. The problem is the media being too deferential to the man in charge when they approve of his actions, or more likely, when they fear that negative coverage of him would be a boon to Trump. That's what really went wrong in this whole cognitive decline story. The media has given the people the impression they didn't want to ask uncomfortable questions because they realized that doing so, that exposing the central truth that Biden could scarcely serve out his term, let alone be the president until 2028, would make a second Trump presidency inevitable. But the truth matters. Having failed to suppress it, the media is now dealing with the reality of a second Trump presidency, and an environment of absolutely rock bottom levels of trust in the mainstream media. Let's please hold the applause. So you're an occasional visitor to the White House press briefing room.
Yes.
What do you make of the recent changes to it?
I don't like the recent changes to it. That perhaps won't surprise you, but not because I regard them as interlopers, to use your word, because I regard them as bootlickers and grovelers. Some of the questions that have been asked have been absurdly soft, and this does get to your point. The purpose of journalism, or the appropriate stance of journalism, is to at least be skeptical of those in power. And what we see from some of these new people who are in that briefing room is an absolute unctuousness toward those in power. There was one instance fairly recently when the correspondent for Lindell TV, Mike Lindell's outlet, asked Caroline Levitt whether you guys...
Your only source for pillow-related news.
Well, exactly. He's the man with the pillow. She asked the White House press secretary whether you guys would consider releasing the president's fitness plan. He actually looks healthier than ever before. That is not by any stretch an appropriate or useful or journalistically valid thing to ask someone who has enormous power.
Well, I think without the rhetorical flurry, without the editorializing that, man, does he look beautiful in like a North Korean sense, but I think asking for his fitness regimen might be a fine thing to do.
I don't think you can strip one context from the other, though. I mean, the question was inherently about telling the press secretary how fantastic the president was looking. Look,
but the point is, they could. I agree with you, but they could be using this opportunity to ask questions, and some people are, to ask questions that the mainstream media, even from a less like like anti-them, just wouldn't occur to them to ask. Like I mean, there's this argument going on the right. There's actual ideological disagreement about foreign policy, about some aspects of the culture wars, about economics for sure. So to add, well, Trump said he was going to do this, but these people in the administration want to do this. What does he think? Like, there is interesting questions you can ask from the conservative perspective. This isn't really my issue or my view, but for instance, more religious social conservatives could be asking about, what about is there a changing prioritization of abortion issues, the pro-life cause, that kind of thing.
Sure.
Again, that wouldn't be my question, but you could have somebody who writes for a pro-life social conservative news site getting at them on that question. I think that would be a perfectly fine use of their time. That'd be good.
I agree, and I would also agree it is unlikely that the New York Times or the Associated Press or I would ask that question. So that, I think, is fair enough. What I find, though, peculiar about the broader picture here is the point of view that you put forward, and that I agree with, that it is the job of the press to be adversarial. I'm just not sure how many people believe that anymore, and there seems to be a real market for just cheerleading. And a classic example of this in the new media seat recently was Tim Pool, the podcaster, who, to my amazement, was hailed for his courage in asking a question that just invited Caroline Levitt to say how unfair the press coverage of Trump was and how much nicer it should be. That is a view that a private individual can hold, but as a question, the idea that it is courageous to serve up softballs to those at the center of power just seems ludicrous to me.
Needs absolutely no assistance in skewering or intellectual adversaries or the Democrats or the media. She is very good at it and didn't need any assistance on that front.
Well, that may be so. I just find it entirely bizarre that these kind of smarmy questions get hailed for their courage. There is no courage at all in cozying up to those in power.
But of course, we wonder why the reason there is this declining trust in the mainstream media is the perception that they didn't ask, or they asked the questions eventually, took them too long, and then didn't really get to the bottom of it until it was so glaringly obvious on the Biden front.
There are things that the mainstream media covered badly or imperfectly, and I would never deny that. I think that the way you just framed the question there, though, underplays the fact that there are people who, for either political or financial reasons, have worked to delegitimize the mainstream media for bad faith reasons in order to further a political agenda or financial gain.
All right, today marks Trump's 100th day in office. Niall will dig into that. You'll hear from Niall's notes coming up next. Niall, what's in your notes?
Well, today, Robbie, it is partly to do with your home state, because Donald Trump will go to Michigan today for a rally marking his 100th day back in power. The president will no doubt boast about his own greatness. Self-praise is no praise, of course, but Trump has spent decades showing he believes otherwise. The problem is that his vanity is often at odds with reality. Here's the thing that neither Trump himself nor his legions of courtiers will ever acknowledge. Donald Trump is not very popular, and he never really has been. Back in 2016, he and Hillary Clinton were the least popular major party candidates in history. Trump eked out an electoral college win while losing the popular vote by almost 3 million to Clinton. In 2020, he lost to Joe Biden comfortably. By the time his hands were finally prized from power after the insurrection he incited, his approval rating was in the 30s. Last November's victory over Kamala Harris may well be Trump's high point in terms of popular appeal. And now, look at him. A new poll from ABC News and the Washington Post found he has the lowest 100-day approval of any president in the past 80 years. In the polling average maintained by the Hill's partner, Decision Desk HQ, Trump's job approval rating now sits roughly 9 points underwater. On the day he was inaugurated, he was 17 points into positive territory. It's an astonishingly rapid decline, and it's also an easily explainable one. Because for all the bazillion words printed and spoken about Trump, there are a couple of main reasons why people oppose him. In the first camp are people who recognise him as a dark and aberrational figure, a real outright threat to American democracy. The second, often less ideological tent is filled with those who see him as fundamentally incompetent. Trump being Trump, he has given ample evidence to support both those theories in the past 100 days. Now, I'll come to the threats to democracy in a minute, but it's clear from the polls that the competence question is reaching some Americans in a way that grander arguments do not. There's no better example than the Liberation Day tariffs. They are Trump's biggest self-inflicted wound so far. His April 2nd announcement cratered the markets, sparked fears of renewed inflation, and drew warnings from retailers about empty shelves. Trump persevered for a week before this supposedly immovable and courageous president turned tail. The main reason was that the bond markets turned queasy. Here he is, 1 week after Liberation Day.
I was watching the bond market. The bond market is very tricky. I was watching it, but if you look at it now, it's beautiful. The bond market right now is beautiful. But yeah, I saw last night where people were getting a little queasy. I think everything had, well, the big move wasn't what I did today. The big move was what I did on Liberation Day.
What he did on Liberation Day has messed up the perceptions of his ability to manage the economy. A Fox News poll released last week found that the percentages of registered voters disapproving of his performance on tariffs and the broader economy was way up into the 50s. The approval numbers way down in the 30s. The tariff trauma is part of a larger picture of incompetence too. There was the group chat about an imminent attack on Yemen that included a journalist by mistake. The claims of savings by Elon Musk's Doge that proved false. The firings as part of that effort of workers on crucial topics like nuclear safety and bird flu that had to be reversed. And now to the other part of the story. I suppose Trump's fans and foes agree on one thing. He's certainly exceptional, exceptionally resilient, and also exceptionally dangerous. A quick reminder of what he's done during his first 100 days. Punished law firms that represented his opponents, made a power grab at colleges seeking to control what they teach, ordered the Justice Department to investigate 2 critics by name, removed security protection from people with whom he's disagreed, given clemency to thugs convicted of January the 6th offences, including attacks on police officers, ignored a court order to turn around deportation flights, ignored an immigration court order not to deport Kilmar Abrego Garcia to El Salvador, called for a judge's impeachment. Oh, and also imprisoned people in El Salvador on next to no evidence. Every one of these details forms a damning bigger picture. The deportations issue isn't only about immigration, it's about whether Trump will obey the rule of law. The attack on the law firms isn't about the finer points of jurisprudence, and the attack on colleges isn't really about anti-Semitism. It's about using the heavy hand of government to crush potential centres of dissent. Millions of Americans believe the evidence of their own eyes. They see that Donald Trump has more contempt for democratic values than any other president of their lifetimes. Contempt for dissent, contempt for pluralism, contempt for any form of restraint upon his political appetites. And so that's where the Trump record stands at 100 days. Incompetence on one hand, creeping authoritarianism on the other. It's no wonder he's already in trouble.
Well, we know that President Trump would not have gotten a positive grade from Niall on any of these fronts, even before the recent news. Look, I concede that Trump's approval ratings are rapidly slipping. I think what's interesting is that they were still pretty good until about like a month and a half ago, and it seems clear that it's the tariffs. The big thing is the tariffs, and that is the policy under which, even though I'm on the right of center seat, I am most estranged from Trump on. I think it was not a good idea. I support the efforts by Rand Paul currently in the Congress to actually wrest control of tariff policy from the executive. And it, as you said, is very self-inflicted because there was no demand to do this. There was demand to do this from a number of idiosyncratic thinkers inside the MAGA coalition, like Peter Navarro, and basically no one else. And
Steve Bannon, perhaps.
And Steve Bannon, but Steve Bannon, he wants high taxes. He wants to destroy businesses. He wants to do things that typically conservatives don't want to do. Some of the things that typical conservatives want to do, I think, are bad, like bombing and invading every other foreign country. But this is one where you could stick to what the normal Republican policy was, and you would do well. The only caveat I guess I will add to your analysis is that I think right now the Democrats are benefiting from having no clear face of their party. They are kind of going, after all, with the James Carville do nothing and wait for Trump to make a mistake. I think you can't argue Trump has made a mistake in terms of the tariff policy. When there's a prominent Democrat back on the scene, someone for Republicans to point to and say, this is what it's going to be if it's not going to be Trump, is this what you want? The approval ratings might rebound. Trump is subject to some normal political at the end of the day. He has a low ceiling and a high floor, but there is fluctuation in there among the group of independents, particularly in the swing states, who don't love everything about Trump but really didn't like what they were going to get from Biden and Harris. And once I think they're reminded of that, particularly if what Democrats decide to do is a hard pivot to the left, given that that's the only thing they have going for them right now. I think that could help Trump.
On the point of the tariffs, I do agree, and I think I made the point in those notes that I do think the tariff question reaches voters who are not otherwise estranged from Trump. Kamala Harris did, of course, make the democracy argument in the lead up to the election, and she still lost. Now, I would argue that the things he has done are even more egregious since then, but there's no question that the tariffs do reach voters who are more in the middle ground or who are less animated by ideological concerns or concerns about pluralism. But I mean, I know we're probably shortly out of time, but from a libertarian standpoint, surely you must have quite a few fears, given that, as I understand libertarianism, part of its central sort of warning is about the heavy hand of government. You must have major concerns about the way he's using that, surely.
Oh, I do. I don't know. I've made no secret of the fact that I think the deportations are going well beyond what can be justified, and it's not about he's a wonderful father or something, so he should be returned to the country. But they should do what the court justices say, and frankly, the revocations of the visa status for the students was actually more troubling to me, because that is very clearly a speech and due process issue where I think is just utterly indefensible and is such a clear violation of my principles. But, I'm not a cheerleader for either side.
I understand.
Would be very upset and cross with Democrats, I'm sure, if they were in charge. Trump briefly tricked me or fooled me for the first couple weeks before these kinds of overreaches started on tariffs and deportations and things, and it was just going to be Doge slashing areas of government. I was like, oh, I guess I can get on board with this. This is mostly just what I want. Now they're doing a lot more of the stuff I don't really want, and it's unfortunate.
We found
it's a missed opportunity.
We found a degree of harmony before you implicitly expressed your admiration for Elon Musk, and then we diverged again.
No, he's going to be out of the picture, and Trump will be more governed by people that I think. Well, we'll have to find out what their economic policies are, but I have a feeling I'm not going to like them, and you're not going to like them either.
I think that is true.
Next up, it was a stunning return for the Liberals in Canada's election last night, thanks in large part to Trump's threats against our northerly neighbor, the 51st state. Don't think that's going to happen. Stay tuned. Time to talk about Canada. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney will keep his job for the next 4 years after Carney's Liberal Party won the federal election in a stunning course reversal fueled by the souring relationship with the United States.
The election was in many ways a referendum on Trump and which party could most effectively counter the American president's trade war and efforts to make the Great White North the 51st state in the Union.
Trump trolled Canadian voters ahead of the election on Monday, saying in a post on Truth Social, "Elect the man who has the strength and wisdom to cut your taxes in half, increase your military power for free to the highest level in the world, have your car, steel, aluminum, lumber, energy, and all other businesses quadruple in size with zero tariffs or taxes if Canada becomes the cherished 51st state."
Leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, shot back in a post on X saying, quote, "President Trump, stay out of our election. Canada will always be proud, sovereign and independent, and we will never be the 51st state." Poilievre's defiance of Trump didn't seem to help sway voters. The CBC projected Monday night that he himself had lost his seat in Parliament.
In spite of all this, Trump didn't seem fazed. In an interview with The Atlantic, he acknowledged that the Conservative candidate was ahead by 25 points before he started his trolling. He actually used the interview to troll Canada again, writing, "I've thrown the election into a close call, right? I don't even know if it's a close call, but the Conservative, they didn't like Governor Trudeau too much, and I would call him Governor Trudeau, but he wasn't fond of that."
Strangely enough, who could have guessed that the Prime Minister of an independent sovereign nation wouldn't like being called governor by the President of the United States?
Yes, after Trudeau's fall, the Conservative Party was polling quite well.
Way
for a
ahead.
while,
Yeah.
way ahead, and then Trump, the presumption is that Trump ruined all that. I'm looking for the, that's a very, mainstream narrative, so I'm trying to understand, well, okay, what is the other perspective? And I'm actually just not seeing it. I don't know what anyone else is saying about this. I mean, maybe they're saying, well, we don't care because who cares what Canada does? And it seems like Trump is ambivalent at best toward the fate of the Conservative Party in Canada, and at worst would be happy to have the Liberals in charge. He thinks they're a weaker negotiating position, or they're just more feminine and will bend to his will, like the maple syrup chugging people that I don't know.
I think that's been a bit too generous to Trump in his capacity for four-dimensional chess or whatever people credit him with sometimes. Look, I think that he was obviously a massive issue in this campaign, not just because of the trade war, but also because of that sort of derision that he exhibits toward Canadian independence, sovereignty, the idea that it would somehow willingly submit to being the 51st state. You try that with any free nation on earth and people are going to rebel against it. Now, there was obviously the additional question of how exactly to deal with his tariffs. In terms of, yes, I take the point that not everything is purely a referendum on American politics or on Trump in foreign nations. I mean, I guess one thing that also helped the Liberals was simply Trudeau stepping down and Carney being elected in his place. So you didn't have a Prime Minister who had been there for years and years and could quite so easily be tarred as, part of the establishment, although Carney's not much of a flamethrower, but that I think did help the Liberals. But look, if you look at the polls and you look at when they shifted, it's pretty obvious that Trump did his opponents a huge favor by what he did.
The problem I have with the 51st state talk is what if that actually, that's not going to happen, but if it actually happened, that would be very bad for the American Republican Party because it would add a large number of electoral votes to a solidly blue, what would be an extremely blue state.
An extremely large state as well.
An extremely large state with what? Then they're going to get 2 senators, a bunch of House seats.
Yeah.
What are we doing, guys? I don't even understand it. What are you thinking?
Do you think Democrats should be strongly in favor
Yes.
of annexing Canada?
Yes. Well, just as they're in favor of D.C. statehood, which is opposed by Republicans on purely, on correct strategic and tactical grounds. That would be the most liberal state in the country,
Right.
and we would get the Democrats would get two Senate seats, 3 electoral votes, and a House seat, and that would be disastrous.
Well,
so it's never going to happen.
Well, the voters of the District of Columbia, including you and me, are deprived of our proper representation because the Republican Party won't acknowledge that it deserves representation because, as you say, you would have 2 Democratic senators and at least a
I would
House
just
member.
add us to. We should just be added to Maryland or Virginia or something. Is what I would
Well,
do. It should be its own. That's how I would solve the no, we're not represented policy. Is just make us part of probably Maryland. Make us part of Maryland.
I mean, I think that DC statehood is a better option, but I don't want to get off the topic. Of
Yes, because you want to add electoral votes for Democrats.
No, because look, the whole thing about the Canadian, it is the reason I laughed when you were saying about DC is you can't really make a serious comparison between the capital of the United States and a foreign country who Trump is just pontificating about somehow seizing or having its people give up their independence in order to incorporate themselves into the United States. I mean, on some level he's trolling. On another level, it's just a fundamental act of disrespect to another sovereign nation.
Yeah, I think we should strive toward positive relationships with Canada and our other neighbors, including, most importantly, good trade arrangements that will mutually enrich us and them and maybe make them more favorably inclined toward market principles and limited governance that would make the Conservative Party more popular there. I think that's the way to do it, and that's what I'm in favor of. But we do not have a change in the governance of Canada as of yet.
Our Canadian cousins have prudently come down on the side of centre-left governance again, Robbie.
Oh dear. All right. Coming up on Rising, the unexpected Atlantic interview and how 2 reporters were able to get President Trump's personal cell phone number and convince him to talk to them. Stay tuned. Dropped a new interview with the Commander-in-Chief ahead of his 100-day mark.
Trump described the difference between his first and second terms. Quote, "The first time I had 2 things to do, run the country and survive. I had all these crooked guys," Trump said. "And the second time, I run the country and the world."
Trump also discussed whether he'd run in 2028, telling the outlet, "It's not something that I'm looking to do, and I think it would be a very hard thing to do."
Another notable tidbit from the interview is the authors describing how they scored the interview. Apparently, Trump had cancelled the initial interview, but the 2 authors persisted. They write, "But we've both covered Trump long enough to know that his first word is rarely his final one. So at 10:45 on a Saturday morning in late March, we called him on his cell phone. Don't ask how we got his number. All we can say is that the White House staff have imperfect control over Trump's personal communication devices."
Trump also discussed how the billionaire class has a higher level of respect for him now. He expressed his continuing confidence in Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and they'd had a talk with him. Trump responded also to concerns from the Atlantic reporters about potentially deporting an American resident or citizen by accident. "Let me tell you that nothing will ever be perfect in this world," he said. Does that comfort you, Niall?
It does not comfort me very much.
Nothing's ever perfect.
No.
Oopsies.
And nothing's ever perfect as he goes on the tirades that he frequently goes on and, in my view, tramples across all kinds of democratic norms. The piece itself actually is very good because what it really is about is mapping Trump's return from the very low point that he found himself in after he left office the first time back to power. And it's a very in-depth look at that, some of the difficulties they had getting even like media attention. I had forgotten about the speech that launched his re-election campaign being kind of a dud and there weren't really very high profile people there. And then the way that gradually turned around. You know, the authors are, I would say, appropriately critical of Trump. They talk about his shamelessness being an asset and that kind of thing. But, you know, good piece. Glad they got him on his cell phone.
It's, yes, on that low point for Trump, it is, you know, important to recall, now it seems like a distant memory, that there was a time period where conservative media, I would mostly say, desperately tried to move on from Trump, as did many in leadership. They tried to anoint Ron DeSantis as the successor to Trump and push Trump off stage and say, nope, now it's going to be DeSantis. And that effort failed spectacularly. The base still wanted Trump. It was not universal. It wasn't a 95-5 kind of fight, but it was always like a 65-35 fight. Trump was never really in too much danger. I would argue, particularly when the law enforcement actions, the justice system actions against Trump really kicked into high gear. That seemed to, paradoxically, on the right, evaporate any desire to have someone other than Trump be the candidate. There was I will now, crawl through broken glass to support him kind of phenomenon that actually did not help DeSantis at all.
Yeah, that piece does go into some of that and the fundraising boosts that he got, particularly around the time of his first indictment. And he himself argues that the prosecutions made him stronger. My question or caveat about that is, there was one of the prosecutions that I thought was a bit flimsy, and it turned out to be the one that went to its conclusion and of which he was convicted. He's still convicted of a felony at the end of the day. But the other matters, and you and I have spoken about this before, I think where there was overwhelming evidence of criminality. He would have got his chance in court at some point to try to rebut those allegations, but particularly the Mar-a-Lago obstruction case, I thought, was rock solid. And so in that instance, are Democrats supposed to not back that because they're worried about there being political backlash? It seems to me that you either believe in upholding the law or you don't.
Yeah, I mean, there were also efforts that I would judge to be highly questionable to also keep him off the ballot. Actions taken by Democratic elections officials in the states to interpret the law to say that you couldn't even put his name on the ballot, that I think that was very strategically unwise. Not that that was a strategy on the part of the National Party, but they didn't exercise any discipline to stop those people. And then they platformed those people in left of center media or mainstream media when they made those kinds of efforts. What else to say about this interview? He talked about, I found it interesting, actually I'm not sure if it was this one or the Goldberg interview, right? There were two interviews in the Atlantic, right? He also spoke to Jeffrey Goldberg, or he's having dinner with him. It is all the Atlantic, saying that actually that there's two kinds of people in his administration. There are people who just want to do great things for the country and people who want to do great things from the country and get a little bit of vengeance. And he said, surprisingly, I'm actually more in the former camp. I just want to do great things for the country.
I mean,
he's not the vengeful official.
There's no evidence of that at all. He's instructing his Justice Department to go after Miles Taylor and Chris Krebs. He's trying to punish law firms. We went into all this earlier in the show. But he is obviously motivated by a desire for retribution.
He says he's not.
He can say all that. He
also said he's not going to run. This whole running for a third term thing which Steve Bannon is trying to manifest out of nowhere. I think it's just not going to. I think J.D. Vance is going to run to be the successor to Trump, and maybe some other people will run, but it is extraordinarily likely that J.D. Vance runs and is the nominee next time, and Trump is not himself going to seek a third term.
Well, we'll see. I mean, I'm always skeptical for those things that initially get floated as trolling or as humor and then become more serious over time. I certainly think Bannon's serious about it, and Trump has left the door open at times. The other point about J.D. Vance, maybe, but we just don't know where we will be in approximately 3 years from now, how the Trump administration will be seen. And we were talking earlier about the polls sliding quite precipitously only 100 days in. So I think there are real dangers of that situation becoming so bad that people are ultimately discredited.
Republicans will have to be considering to pick an extremely moderate Republican to appeal to the Canadian vote when it's the 51st state, I guess.
Nikki Haley, perhaps.
Yeah. Oh dear, oh no. Up next, George Mason University calls the cops on one of their own students for an anti-Trump blog. We'll discuss. College student wrote a blog post about killing tyrants. Some people read it as a call for violence against Trump. That viral post did land him a visit from the Secret Service. It's titled, "When Must We Kill Them?" It's the title of that George Mason University PhD student Nicholas Decker's Substack post. The article invoked themes from 250-year-old writings of Thomas Jefferson and George Mason, the latter of whom GMU is named after. Both founding fathers championed resisting tyranny, even broached the concept of rising up against it.
In his piece, Decker derides the Trump administration and contemplates whether violence is justified as a last resort against what he perceives as tyrannical rule unfolding in America. GMU took swift action, calling the cops on Decker, but they in turn determined that he broke no laws.
Joining us now is First Amendment attorney at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, Zach Greenberg. Welcome to Rising, Zach.
Thank you for having me.
Great to speak with you. I'm obviously a big fan of the work that FIRE does, and we talk a lot about campus free speech issues on this show because it's issues near and dear to my heart. What is at stake here in terms of the post the student wrote that did, as far as I'm aware, come maybe closer to an open advocacy for violence than sometimes is the case when people say, oh, this is violent, or this is, you can't do this. We're strong believers in free speech. But what was at stake here?
It's the chilling effect. It's the notion of a university calling the cops on one of its students for writing about politics. I think any of us would be deterred from writing about Trump, politics, America today if we got a visit from the police, the Secret Service, for what we wrote. And this is really detrimental at a university that promises free speech. It's actually one of the better schools for free speech in America. If this is going to become a practice of calling the police on students, faculty members for discussing politics, it's going to be a very long 4 years and a very detrimental climate for free speech on this college campus.
Zach, we've often been critical of President Trump here, and I was critical often on this show today. But when you say writing about politics, I mean, I do think we owe it to our audience to quote some of what the article in question says. The PhD student is referring to the Trump administration, and he writes, "In short, we must decide when we must kill them. None of us wish for war, but if the present administration wishes to destroy the nation, I would accept war rather than see it perish. I hope that you would choose the same." Even from a standpoint that is very critical of President Trump, that seems very close to incitement to violence, if not over that line to me, no?
There's a clear difference between true threats, serious intent to commit unlawful violence, and political speech. And we have the right as Americans to discuss and even justify violence. We can talk about the means of violence and when it should be used against certain circumstances. But a student using conditional language, using if and when, and asking the question of whether violence should occur is a big difference from specifically calling and intending to commit violence against a specific person. And this is very clearly political speech, it's political philosophy. It happens in philosophy classes and online across America. And we should preserve the right to talk about these issues because as Americans, we should be able to at least have a discussion on when unlawful violence is justified and what it means for our constitutional democracy.
So it's the difference between saying we ought to overthrow violently, if necessary, the government under certain conditions, and saying I am planning to commit violence at this time using this means against this person. That's kind of the line there. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And the context matters here. If the student was talking about committing violence against a specific GMU professor, a student talking about how he's going to bring guns to campus and then shoot up school on a certain date, yes, the university can get involved. They can call law enforcement. They can make their case. But a student simply out there discussing politics, talking abstractly about violence against Trump, who, by the way, has the means to defend himself and has the Secret Service at his disposal, a public university, GMU, has no business getting involved with that.
But and is it you think it's appropriate as well for the Secret Service to just kind of check up and make sure that he does not, in fact, have verify that this isn't some unhinged person who's going to be hiding in the bushes at Mar-a-Lago, the next moment, because Donald Trump obviously did face two real, one successful in wounding him and killing someone else, assassination attempts in the last year?
I don't think so. The student made very, very clear in not only the essay, but also in an edit, that violence is the last resort, that it should only be justified when all other lawful and peaceful means have failed. That he believes in protest, believes in using the system, the lawful means to effect change. So I don't think this is a candidate for the Secret Service to visit. I think doing so is very chilling, not only his writings, but all students at GMU. And I think the Secret Service has better things to do than visit people for their political speech and for going to people's houses and questioning them for what they write on Substack.
See, I have mixed feelings about this, Zach, because I do, on one hand, completely accept the argument that you made a few moments ago about the idea that it is actually an important philosophical question as to whether and when political violence can be justified. I grew up in the north of Ireland when there was an armed conflict there. That was obviously a debate that was had. It's a debate that is salient right now in relation to the Middle East. It was a discussion that I remember about the ANC in South Africa, or the PLO. But so I think that is obviously legitimate grounds for inquiry and discussion. But whenever someone writes about things like violence, that I hope you would choose the same, I don't know if it's over the line, but it's getting very, very close to the line, I would have thought. You don't see it that way.
I don't see it that way. I think the lines, I hope you would choose the same, really relate back to the title, when must we kill them? He's asking a question, he's posing these philosophical questions about when we do approach that line and when it is justified. And another note here is that GMU was inundated with comments, with criticism. The article itself has a couple thousand comments on it criticizing the student here. So there's a good chance that the university was only responding to its critics, its donors, its students because of the offensiveness of the speech instead of an actual safety issue here. And again, there was no safety to actually anybody at JMU. We're talking about alleged threats against the university president. So for the university itself to call for a law enforcement investigation, potentially criminal behavior for one of its students, that's where you get the chilling effect there. And, we could disagree on whether the content of the expression here is a true threat or not. I think it's pretty clearly political speech, but we can talk about that. But I think the interest here of the university here, why they're trying to call the cops on one of its students, that's the real issue. That's the real chilling effect here, and it deters others in the university from speaking out against similar issues, especially when they want to relate the same kind of language that Mr. Decker was using.
Yeah, I would certainly defend his rights to write this post if he was being disciplined by his university or something like that. I obviously totally agree with your legal analysis. For me, the question of whether it was right for the Secret Service to maybe just look into it, at least for me, is a little bit more of an open question. But we appreciate you coming on, making the case to defend robustly, even provocative and unpopular speech. It is an important thing to do in this day and age. Really appreciate it. Zach Greenberg of FIRE.
Thank you for having me. Absolutely.
Next up, Democratic Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker has some choice words for his own party. Step up or get stepped on. That's next.
This Democratic governor has called for mass protests and disruptions and is calling out what he says are do-nothing Democrats. Laying ground for a potential 2028 presidential bid, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker gave a fiery speech in New Hampshire, and this was his message to the Republicans.
Never before in my life have I called for mass protests, for mobilization, for disruption, but I am now. These Republicans cannot know a moment of peace. Folks, the reckoning is here.
Pritzker joined MSNBC's Inside with Jen Psaki Monday night and said this about his fellow Democrats.
We as Democrats to recognize this is the moment where we need to convey to people what we really stand for. Didn't do a great job of it, frankly, in the last election, and that's why we didn't win as Democrats. It's time to speak out, and then, very importantly, we have to deliver.
Many on the right bashed Governor Pritzker. Liz Wheeler, host of the Liz Wheeler Show, wrote on X, "I warned before the election the left is planning the BLM riots 2.0. It's coming." And Benny Johnson wrote on X, "Insane. J.B. Pritzker is still on live television citing violence against Trump supporters, except now he's comparing the U.S. to Nazi Germany.
Oh, you know how much I love a Benny Johnson tweet.
Well,
really.
look, I
This
don't...
ludicrousness about inciting violence.
Yes, I don't think he's inciting violence, although I always note when we discuss this that I think every even remotely spicy thing a right-wing political figure or media figure says about fighting the left or fighting the Democrats gets characterized as a call to political violence by mainstream media folks. So I think this similarly is just rhetoric. I mean, I didn't think the line, that they should not know a moment of peace. I think I don't think that's a call for violence. It's just kind of an unkind remark, but
Exactly.
we should all know moments of peace, but
I mean,
I don't know.
He's someone who is making the argument forcibly and forcefully that the current administration is way off track and is, I think, is an administration and a president that is traducing the American Constitution and laws and norms. But to say that he's saying that there should be mobilization and protest, it's basically a version of no justice, no peace. But that is not, to suggest that that is a call to violence. It's a call to mass mobilization and protest, which is completely different.
But why is Jen Psaki so excited about this? Why is anyone so excited about this? How is this different from anything? Democrats are getting like participation trophies for just saying we should resist Trump, we should protest, we should do things. What are you going to do? And he said we didn't do a good job of communicating the message. I don't agree with that. I think they didn't do a good job of communicating the message, and also there is no message. Like, what do they stand for that people want? I don't think the Democratic Party has figured out what it stands for. Is it? I've been happy to see Democrats be so frustrated with what Trump's doing on the economy and be wanting more free trade and more the end of tariffs. But is that actually what the popular left people in the Democratic Party who are actually getting all the attention, Bernie Sanders and AOC, I thought they don't like free trade and they do like tariffs. So I think the economic policy of the Democratic Party has not worked out at all, except in a just whatever Trump does, we want to do the opposite for the moment. And then it's not clear that the left people are even going to win this scuffle. Like right now, there is no face of the more establishment Democratic movement, but as soon as that face becomes either Josh Shapiro or maybe Gavin Newsom or something, then maybe the Bernie AOC people will just be banished to the sidelines again. I have no idea. Or they could win and take over the party, and then I don't think their message will actually resonate with people. But it's a call to do what? I don't get why they're being. This is same goes for Cory Booker, who is getting like, oh my God, we're so glad at what he did. But what did he do? I'm not saying there's anything wrong with what he did. It just, I don't see the novel character of it.
So I think why people are excited about Pritzker is that while there are all the debates that you just outlined going on, here's this guy who is being very rhetorically fiery about resistance to the Trump agenda. And resistance to the Trump agenda is, in fact, the glue that binds the Democratic Party together right now. Yes, there are all of these other debates, but a lot of those debates are things that are, by their nature, difficult. So, for example, the issue about more identitarian politics and trans rights and all of that. It's like, I see the argument, and I largely agree with the argument, that the most progressive wing on things like trans rights has caused electoral problems for the Democratic Party. I also see the counter-argument that if the Democratic Party isn't there to stand up for marginalized people, what's its purpose? So that is why those kind of fissures are very painful for Democrats. And there's an understandable desire to come together in that kind of opposition to Trump that Pritzker is enunciating. Now, I do think that it is pretty clear what AOC and Bernie Sanders stand for, which is that more economically populist, fighting the oligarchy approach. And they've obviously drawn very big crowds in doing that.
And they say that every billionaire, the existence of a billionaire is a policy failure.
Right.
J.B. Pritzker is himself
a
a billionaire.
And then that
right? Didn't they go back to back at the convention? Bernie railing against billionaires, and then the next person on stage was J.B. Pritzker.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Someone in the comments. I'm pretty sure that's how it went down.
No, I mean I think that was close, and I think that Pritzker's wealth is a problem for him if he is indeed serious about running in 2028, and I think he probably is. It is obviously difficult to persuade skeptical voters that a billionaire is on the side of working people. Now, Trump has managed it falsely, I would argue, but he has clearly plugged into that idea. I think that it is a problem in the Democratic Party because of that skepticism of extreme wealth and how extreme wealth is acquired and who gets, as it were, not exactly manipulated, but taken advantage of in the process of that accumulation of wealth.
We have started to see some level of protesting against Trump and against Elon Musk. I would say it still seems to be mostly from very hardcore Democrats, very partisan Democrats. I don't know if we're seeing really mass opposition. I'm not discounting that we could get there. I think if we saw protesting that moves into like rioting, that would actually be to Trump's advantage. But
well, it probably would. But let's not leap ahead of where we are. I mean, there are protests now in quite a few red states, and to get back to the AOC Sanders thing, they have drawn very big crowds in very, very conservative states. I can't remember whether it was Idaho or Utah where they had a huge rally, and AOC was talking about the fact that this is talked about as Trump country, but it's our country. So that message is resonating with people. And I also think, related to that, Robbie, there are so many people in this country who are very dissatisfied with just the way things are, that it is a very fertile atmosphere for people like Trump on one hand and people like AOC on the other, because they are, for all their vast differences, disruptive figures who channel that anger at the establishment or Washington or the way things have always run.
People hate the establishment of both parties to a large degree. Trump's great political success is always being able to rail against the establishment in his party, despite being the unquestioned leader of the party. He has more power over the party than ever before. The party has no power over him. He is the party, but he still portrays himself quite successfully among Republicans as being antagonistic toward, or if I'm not here, we'll go right back to rule by Mitch McConnell and the neocons, which there might actually be some truth to. Or now if he is replaced by J.D. Vance, I think that's unlikely. But once Trump is off the scene, if there could be an ideological battle where a different faction of Republicans assume control again.
There could theoretically, but do you not think that the Trump MAGA forces have kind of vanquished what used to be called the Republican establishment? I mean, those people...
Unfortunately, no.
You don't really?
I wish they had.
You think they could, those McConnellite type people could come back?
I think they're still in power. I think
Really?
behind the scenes, it's still a lot of them. I mean, what's happening in the Pentagon, to me, is a clear indication of that. This is an area of policy where I am at my most positively disposed toward Trump, is the America First foreign policy agenda of not getting involved in costly wars all over the globe. And what I see happening is a behind-the-scenes... Mike Walls, who is the political figure responsible for Jeffrey Goldberg being in a Signal chat, is not of the America First foreign policy. He's a Cheneyite, and he might survive in that role longer than Hegseth does. So that's these people have proven very difficult to get out of key roles in government, and I think that's to the detriment of implementing the aspects of Trump's policy I most want to see implemented. And I do now. I worry if Trump's gone, they will just resume power, although, again, J.D. Vance, on this particular issue, I think might actually be even better than Trump at countering their influence. We saw, actually, from that chat that he was interested in pushing back on what everybody else wanted to do in terms of the foreign policy. So I think that fight will continue to be fought, and maybe they'll be kept at bay, but like some dark, mystical, Sauron-like Lord of the Rings force, never permanently vanquished, always lurking in the shadows.
You know, so obviously we have differing views on the war in Ukraine in particular, and I would be much more supportive of aid to Ukraine, and I think the America First thing essentially enables Russia to succeed in invading another sovereign nation. But I do think that there is this broader divide that you've outlined in the Republican Party. It just seems to me that the Trump forces have almost entirely overrun those people, and figures like Walls are a kind of outlier who has now aligned himself much more, at least publicly, with
What if
it.
they're just biding their time?
Well,
Biding their
maybe.
time.
Up next, the New York Times is getting backlash for praising a controversial Twitch streamer. Stay tuned for that.
The New York Times is getting some backlash for its apparently glowing review of controversial Twitch streamer Hasan Piker.
The Times initially headlined its profile, "A Progressive Mind in a MAGA Body," with the subhead reading, "Hasan Piker pumps iron, likes weapons, and wears pearls. His brand of masculinity has won him many fans online and has been a useful vehicle for his politics."
The Times, however, apparently changed that headline to read, "A progressive mind in a body made for the manosphere." Piker, as some of you may know, has said some contentious things in the past. He once suggested that he didn't, quote, have an issue with Hezbollah. Piker also said the U.S. deserved the 9/11 attack, something the New York Times did note in the piece.
The Times' profile touched on the fact that Piker gets away with things he says and does, like painting his nails or wearing pearls, because he has what one sociologist called jock insurance. In other words, his masculine gender capital gives him leeway to do and say outside-the-box things. The Times also conceded that part of why he's popular is due to the fact that he's, quote, a very handsome man.
Lucky him. Reactions abounded on X. Journalist Mary Catherine Ham wrote this: "I kinda love that gushing media coverage of Hasan has to apologize for the fact that he's good looking and fit. Like, don't worry, although he looks like he's seen the inside of a gym. Bad, that's right coded. He's a shill for disastrous socialism and murderous terrorists, which is good."
Meanwhile, journalist Mehdi Hassan wrote on Blue Sky, "I'm glad the New York Times profiled Hasan Piker, but calling his use of the word genocide to describe Gaza extreme is insane. Some of Israel's top Holocaust scholars are calling it a genocide, as are Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. Absurd from the NYT."
So, this profile, I think, was interesting and flawed in a variety of ways. It was very glowing toward Hasan Piker. The author seems to have a crush on this guy. It described, yes, he's a good-looking man who works out. Congrats to him. It was that point over and over and over again. Like, that's shocking. Also, it's kind of weird, the initial framing that, like...
A MAGA body, that part.
Right, liberals are trying to manifest the idea that only conservative people work out. I'm not even sure that on average, if you went through the entire country, that conservative people are going to be in better shape than liberal people. It probably breaks down by income level and a bunch of other things.
And urban, rural, and all that.
There is something true, however, to the fact now that, I mean, I've seen plenty of articles in like ridiculous liberal publications being like, do you like working out?
There are no ridiculous liberal publications, Robbie.
Like,
what's that?
I was thinking like Jezebel type place. I don't even know if Jezebel's still in operation. Something like that. Like, working out is right-wing coded, and are you secretly a fascist if you work out? There has been a lot of that discourse in progressive circles now, so I see where they got this idea, but it's not true that working out is somehow right-wing coded. Look, I don't actually pay very much attention to Hasan Piker. He is a big deal on Twitch. He's very, very left-leaning, like extremely socialist, extremely anti-Israel. I didn't know, one thing I learned from reading this piece, which I didn't know, but maybe everyone knows, is that he admits to being a Nepo baby. He got his start. I assumed he just like emerged naturally on playing video games on Twitch the way a lot of people does. But no, Cenk Uyghur's his uncle.
Right, and gave him a job with the Young Turks. Yeah.
Which, that's fine. I like Cenk Uyghur. There's nothing wrong with that. He just didn't emerge totally out of nowhere.
Right.
Everybody, it turns out, is connected to somebody else. What did you make of the piece?
So I found it an interesting piece. I found it kind of curious because I, like you, I'm aware of that he exists, right? But obviously I'm not on Twitch on a regular basis listening to his 8 hours of gaming and commentary while he's on there. To me, in terms of the politics of what he said, which seems to be exercising the right a lot, some of the things that he is being lambasted for seem to me to be sort of clumsy wordings of legitimate arguments. So, for example, on the Gaza thing, he's talking about the fact that he believes essentially that the Israeli response to October 7th has been so brutal that it can't be justified regardless of exactly what happened on October 7th. He regards it as disproportionate whether or not there were Israeli people raped on October 7th or not. That is not something I would say. I don't think it is wise or sensitive to get into that whole debate about, well, if people were or weren't raped, that changes or doesn't change the equation. But I see his central point is that the Israelis have gone in, killed people in the tens of thousands, and nothing can justify that. That seems to me to be his argument. September 11th, again, I would not say what he said. I'm not sure that it means that he should be, I don't know, exiled from Twitch or anywhere else.
I certainly don't want him exiled from Twitch. I'm against censorship. He should be able to say whatever provocative things he wants. I do not think every criticism of what Israel does is necessarily anti-Semitic, and I'm always okay, what exactly did they say?
Right.
Never take their word for
Right.
it on when that's being alleged. Now, all of that said, the things he's actually said over the years seem pretty incendiary to me. Again, I'm not clutching my pearls. Unlike him, I don't wear any, so I have none
No
to
pearls
clutch.
to clutch.
But he just says some awful stuff.
Well, I think he's curious that Hezbollah
he says really violent stuff. He said I don't agree with Dan Crenshaw's views generally, but that he deserved to lose his eye and.
I
deserve 9/11, and everyone who disagrees with him deserves to come to some violent end. And I think if right-wing people, and there are right-wing people who similarly do use insane, contrarian ways of speaking, would not be not just lionized but lusted over in the pages of the New York Times, and so that there's something a little bit selective about what is a disqualifying way of making a provocative point.
Right, and that thing about Dan Crenshaw, I wouldn't defend that in any way at all. And so this is, in some ways, the perils of discussing a person with whom I'm vaguely familiar. If our commenters want to draw my attention to comments like that one about Crenshaw or other things which are plainly
right, and we always want to go and check. Well, what exactly did he say? I never want to rely on someone else's characterization because a lot of those sometimes they're unfair.
Right.
Even for people I still do think are not good. Like Candace Owens, for example, said a lot of things I think are insane over the years. But people say, oh, she's this thing she said was crazy, and they'll look and go, well, that's not that is being not fairly characterized. It happens to everybody. It happens to us, I'm sure.
No, and absolutely. And one of the conversations that I did see being seized upon was Hassan Piker talking about Hezbollah. And as far as I could tell from what I read, his argument was that it's a legitimate resistance movement that has some political support in Lebanon, which the latter part of that is a objective fact, and that was he was. I'm not even sure if it's fair to say defending them, contextualizing them in that way. Now, if he said something that was more endorsing of direct acts of violence, then obviously I wouldn't defend that. But it is, I think one of the reasons that I'm approaching this slightly gingerly is that one of the people who has been most vocal in their opposition to him has been Congressman Richie Torres. A Democratic congressman who has been at the absolute forefront, I would argue, of delegitimizing or seeking to delegitimize criticism of Israel that is legitimate by painting it as inherently anti-Semitic or whatever, pro-terrorism. And so, to your point about not taking people's word for it, I'm highly reluctant to take Richie Torres' word for it.
He did say it doesn't matter if effing rapes happened on October 7th. That's a pretty awful way to put it, I think.
It is a pretty awful way to put it. I mean,
you're just so wrapped up on your ideological commitment that what Israel is doing is wrong that you have to say, well, don't pay attention to that or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, look, those words are awful. They are part of a larger discussion, but I don't think you should say those words. His argument is the Israeli response was so brutal that it would not be justified even if there were rapes.
There's so many other things he says that I can't even repeat on this show because they're so expletive filled, which is what you can do on Twitch, but not on our show.
Yeah.
Interesting, though, that he does have a massive following. He's part of the alternative media ecosystem, and gets a lot more attention for himself. And probably that's what the New York Times was trying to look at. How can, again, it's another Joe Rogan of the left kind of situation. How can we have an appealing, have someone who speaks to young people and has a massive audience that's not totally right-wing branded or vibe-based as the Joe Rogan and Theo Vons and all those people are. But
right. And then in the piece there was this argument about whether Piker is in fact too overtly political or too obviously animated by politics in a way that Rogan isn't, and so does that limit his appeal in a way that Rogan's appeal is less limited.
And he works out. Amazing.
There we go. Astonishing.
Up next, the Trump administration lashes out at Amazon, calling the company hostile for reportedly threatening to expose the cost of tariffs to Amazon goods. Stay tuned. The Trump administration took a shot at Amazon this morning, slamming the online retailer after a report in Punchbowl News alleged that it will soon display the additional cost of President Trump's tariffs on each product. Here's Caroline Levitt this morning.
This is a hostile and political act by Amazon. Why didn't Amazon do this when the Biden administration hiked inflation to the highest level in 40 years? And I would also add that it's not a surprise because, as Reuters recently wrote, Amazon has partnered with a Chinese propaganda arm. So this is another reason why Americans should buy American. It's another reason why we are onshoring critical supply chains here at home to shore up our own critical supply chain and boost our own manufacturing here.
Amazon responded to the administration in a statement saying, quote, "The team that runs our ultra-low-cost Amazon Hall store has considered listing import charges on certain products. This was never a consideration for the main Amazon site, and nothing has been implemented on any Amazon properties." Amazon wouldn't be the first company to introduce tariff pricing. Major online Chinese retailers like Temu and Shein have added fees in response to President Trump's tariffs. What do you make of it all, Robbie?
Look, I think if you're in the position of being the government and saying, no, they shouldn't, we don't want them to talk about how our policies are making it more expensive for them to do business, you're losing. And frankly, that's the kind of policy I associate with like the Elizabeth Warrens of the world, whom I don't like very much. If it's true that Amazon did not publicize the harms of Democratic administration policies, then that's a fair enough point. I'm not sure they were exactly quiet about those things in the past, but everybody at every level rightly complains, in my libertarian view, when the government is raising the cost of them doing business. D.C., they passed a law that changed the paying of restaurant workers, people who work for tips, changing it in some aspect that ended up causing restaurants to have to raise cost on food. And I know restaurants in this city that put on their little menu, the reason the bill is 20% higher is because of this law that has caused. So, so what I'm saying is it is nothing new or unusual for a business to say, prices are changing, here's exactly why. Now, Amazon is saying they're actually not doing that on the main site. This was a little bit of a misreporting, but they have every right to say that we think this policy is bad because it's going to raise prices for us. And the Trump people can turn around and say, nope, that's what we're doing because we think Amazon is complicit with China or whatever. They can say that, that's fine. They can say we're going to do this policy anyway because we think it's good and important for national security. But I think it's just ridiculous. It's ludicrous to criticize Amazon for complaining about it. What, they have to stomach this tariff policy that crashed the economy, that every business hates, that all the business leaders who got behind Trump don't even want to see. They have to deal with it and shut up about it. That's just not a winning argument.
I agree with that. And I think that Caroline Levitt's response there and the sort of edginess or the anger of it is telling in and of itself. Because to me, what that says is that there is a sensitivity in the White House about exactly what Amazon had been reported to be doing, which is drawing a direct line between the Trump policy of imposing tariffs and the possibility of, and the probability of those increasing costs for American consumers. Now, whether Amazon is going to do it on a kind of marginal side site or the main site or whatever, the point is that Trump and Levitt don't want that line that very obviously exists to be drawn. And Trump has always been sensitive about trying to claim credit for either economic good times or of things that are just likely to be popular. I mean, famously during the first term, there was the appending of his signature to the stimulus checks that went out, wanting it to appear almost like the money was directly from him. Here, there's just as direct a correlation between the tariff policy and the increase in prices that will result. Amazon, as you say, would have the right to make that clear. There's nothing wrong with that. I know it annoys Caroline Leavitt, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, it's not unpatriotic to be mad about big government causing higher prices. That's like my entire ideology, is opposing government efforts to make things more expensive. This is, I tweeted this earlier today, but partisanship just so rots people's brains.
Yeah.
If Obama had some new green energy initiative tax carbon system that was raising the cost of certain goods or oil prices, and people said, businesses said, this is the Obama tax, this portion of the price tag is the Obama tax, Republicans and conservatives and conservative media would be calling attention to it.
And delighted with it.
Cheering for them publicizing the negative impacts of Obama's policies. I'm not saying this because I'm like anti-Trump. I want Trump to succeed. And one way in which he would succeed is by not having policies that harm the economy and that make things more expensive. The American people, how many times do they have to signal to their elected, to the people in charge, to the government, we just want things run normally, and we want the economy good, and we don't want everything to cost way too much, especially for artificial, manipulated government reasons. Can we just please be normal? And then they go, well, the Democrats aren't going to give us that. They're promising all this stuff that's bad. Okay, Republicans get a shot. Republicans wreck it immediately. Okay, Democrats are actually the normal ones. Going back to Democrats. Democrats wreck it again. We go back to Republicans. This is our fate for all time.
Well, it may be our fate, but I do think that the hypothetical you raised is really interesting in terms of the broader picture. Your hypothetical about the Obama tax. Had that happened, that would be a very direct and inarguable connection between a policy and prices going up. Now, Leavitt's argument about inflation isn't that, because yes, there is certain legislation that Biden passed that you could certainly argue contributed to inflation. You could also argue...
In fact, I would argue the one that does that is the one called the Inflation Reduction Act.
maybe so, and that's an argument to be made. But there is also the fact that supply chains were messed up following the pandemic. There are various other arguments you can make about the multifaceted causes of an inflation rise in the middle of Biden's term. That is different, and lots of past presidents have been different from this one, where for no real emergency reason, Trump decided to do the tariffs thing, and it is as clear as day that that was a cause and effect of the markets dwindling, of the bond market getting queasy, of all this cascade of effects. That's why I don't think Leavitt's comparison with inflation really works. Here, Amazon was reported, perhaps incorrectly, but was reported to be saying, well, look, here's a policy that went on, here's the price increase that results.
Yeah, on inflation, I would say the causes of inflation are somewhat multifaceted. I think I would argue the two big contributors to inflation, in addition to just the supply chain disruptions of COVID, are excessive government spending and excessive and the printing of money, devaluing the currency over time. That's something
which is the Fed rather than Biden.
Which is the Fed, to be fair. I think we keep saying no reason to do this. I mean, the Trump people, in fairness to them, would say they give three different reasons. They say national security concerns. We cannot be reliant on China. That is the one that probably has the greatest degree of plausibility. Now, of course, the tariffs were not narrowly directed at China. Then the second was, well, we actually don't like tariffs. We are trying to show other countries how bad they are and get them to get rid of them. If what comes of this is 6 months from now, there are lower barriers to trade with the rest of the country, again, I will consider the policy a success and say that the temporary headache and threat was worth it if it's lowered the trade barriers everywhere else. Then the third, the argument that doesn't make any sense, but some people in the Trump administration do want to do it, is they want lasting tariffs in order to make more manufacturing occur in the U.S., even if it does raise the price. I mean, it has to raise the price of goods coming into the country in order to facilitate that. So that's something they're consciously choosing. So those are the three arguments, and it's kind of pick who do you think is most sway or say over Trump, or what the argument is, and thus how long lasting they would be.
Yeah, it is, but the point is that those arguments, at least the third one, is in conflict with the other arguments you cited, because the third one demands not only the rising of prices, but the maintenance of high tariffs on other importing nations over a long period of time, because self-evidently, if you jack up tariffs on Cambodia today, people are not going to just build a factory tomorrow in Ohio. That's not exactly how it works, and it takes time for that to take effect. So the folly of the policy was, to my mind, revealed by the contradictory rationalizations for it.
Well, that does it for us today on Rising. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. See you later.